Every year since 1989, the Library of Congress has selected 25 films to add to the National Film Registry. The criteria? The films must be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant.
Each week on You're Missing Out, we take a look at one of these films to try and get to the heart of why they were selected and why they still matter.
This week, we're talking Salt of the Earth with our producer, Kyle Lampar. Our guest today is our longtime producer, who's been with us for pretty much every one of these episodes as we head toward the 100 mark. And in fact, he's here now because we're doing something special for episode 100. Typically, Kyle has the last episode of the season, but we're switching it up a bit, and we're doing a little bit of a different format for this. So all that to say, for this very unique episode for us, Kyle Lampar joins us to talk about Salt of the Earth and all the phenomenon around it.
Thanks,
Kyle,
Mike.
Kyle, thank you so much for
showing some solidarity.
Absolutely. Listen, you know me. I love me a good labor union movie. So when we were looking at what was going to be the options for this season, I knew I was going to fall in love with this film. So thank you. It was an opportunity.
That's just a bold-faced lie. We just told you this is what you're doing. We're just like, this is what's happening. We all got together and watched it months ago before we started the season. This was one of the films that none of us had seen, and so we all got together and watched it, and we decided this is what we're going to do. But we're doing something a little differently this time. We're kind of going to steal, for the first chunk of this episode, we're not actually going to talk about the movie Salt of the Earth that much. We're going to take a page out of a friend of ours, Ain't It Scary with Sean and Carrie. They've been on the show. We're going to kind of lift their format a little bit because this is a movie I think we can all agree necessitates context. This is a movie that exists within its context. So what's going to happen is I'm going to read basically a little script we put together about the history around this film, and particularly the history around the Hollywood Blacklist, because we may have some folks watching or listening who are unfamiliar with this period of time and the Red Scare and all of that. For them, Red Scare is just a podcast by some annoying people in Dime Square. So we're going to try and clarify what all that is. I'm going to read this off, and Tom and Kyle, who I think have varying degrees of familiarity with this particular period of history and this particular period of film history, can comment and question, and then hopefully we paint an interesting picture of this time, because I've certainly done a lot of research in this era in anticipation of this, and this felt like a good way to kind of get that out. So if you guys are ready, I think we're going to look into this era of cinematic history.
Let's get it.
Let's fucking go.
Movies can certainly be timeless, but no film, indeed no work of art at all, can exist entirely outside of its history. Even works meant to depict the past have truly always served as a reflection of how the past was viewed in the period in which the work reflecting it was made. One need only look at the recent film iterations of novels like Little Women or All Quiet on the Western Front, in contrast with past adaptations, to see how the postures of their particular eras influence what is prioritized on screen. But while often historical context serves simply to add another layer to a work of fiction, like how the childhood fantasy of Gulliver's Travels can be enhanced later in life by learning the political satire at its core, there are certain works that are not just reflections of their time, but born of it in such an abrupt and forceful manner that the umbilical cord is never cut. The context of the work's creation is the lifeblood that allows it to function at all. Absent that, it would wither. This is, I would argue, such the case with a film like Salt of the Earth, which is why it is necessary to try, with the paradoxical aim of the most thorough brevity, to lay out the context of HUAC, the Red Scare, and the infamous Hollywood Blacklist. I mean, I don't know if you guys agree, but I think this is a case of, this is a movie that, if somebody endeavored to watch this without that, and of course this will be available, the film will be available in full on our YouTube channel for people to watch, but I don't know how you feel about that, but I feel like...
Well, yeah, I mean, this is maybe more than any of the movies we've watched in the entirety of this show. Simply exists only for the political point it's trying to make in the political era it exists in. This is, um, um, you know, obviously things get recorded out of order and everything, but for us, this is coming after recording Birth of a Nation. And we talked a lot about that movie, about propaganda, and propaganda tends to have a negative connotation, but not necessarily, because this movie itself is propaganda. It's pro-union, anti-capitalist propaganda, and it really has no other artistic intent other than getting you to be pro-union. And in many cases, I mean, honestly, for the most part with this movie, it is strictly just talking to the people of its era and not trying to get people to watch it on its own terms and like learn the lesson. It simply is just the lesson with no other like other there.
And
It's a particularly interesting yet frustrating experience because um because like it's almost like the opposite of the Birth of a Nation, where like the messaging is good but the filmmaking
well,
and it is so like hard to really
yeah.
it's like everything you said. This is a movie that was almost forcefully born of the moment, and you know, in that sense it almost reminds you of like, I think more than anything, comedies tend to fall into this issue more than others, where if you're not aware of the references they're making, or even like the political like what were the sacred cows that were like, ooh, look at the buttons they're pushing then, and then you watch it 30 years later and you go, well, what's the joke here? Or was that supposed to be like a ooh, I gotcha moment? It's, you know, yeah.
So I wanna jump on something you just introduced, Tom, because I think it's important, tying into what we're gonna move into, which is you said propaganda has a negative connotation, but it doesn't necessarily have to be negative, right? Now
Yeah.
today we're talking about HUAC, we're talking about the Red Scare, we're talking about the act of naming names. And the idea of an informer and of naming names is another thing that carries with it a negative connotation. And I think we might need to explore that here. To begin with, I want to start with talking about the concept of an informer. Today, we tend to look at that concept as entirely negative. Don't snitch being the popular parlance. This can be unhelpfully reductive because it reduces the very chaotic era of McCarthyism and the Red Scare into a very simplistic game of good guys and bad guys. It could be argued that that kind of binary thinking is what led to many called before Congress on suspicion of subversive activity to have been on the Communist Party roll call to begin with. A thinking of, I know the fascists are the bad guys, and the communists are opposed to the fascists, so they must be the good guys. And later, even if they later left the party in disgust, their having ever been on that roll call was enough to condemn them. I bring that point up, and I'll continue, but I bring that point up because we actually just had that earlier this year, depicted in Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. I guess last year at this point,
Over
which
a
is
year ago at this point.
yeah,
Christ.
yeah, which is the idea of trying to narrow things down, especially in this very complicated geopolitical matter, trying to narrow things down to good guy and bad guy. It gets more complicated when you realize that there were people who joined the party with the idea of, I don't like the fascists, I like the communists, or I don't like the fascists, so I must like the communists. And when they saw some of the things that were happening, and Oppenheimer is an example of that, of a guy who looked around this party and went, I don't want no part of this. Like, this stuff is a little, this is pretty dicey. Like, Stalin's out here killing people. His name being on that roll call to begin with is what screwed him over. And I think that, you know, I don't know if you guys had thoughts on that, or otherwise I'll get back to this because there is an interesting element to this.
I will. I mean, I will say many of the people that are put on that blacklist, the Hollywood and 10 included, did feel trapped when navigating a lot of those inquiries because the very acknowledgement of being on that list, whether they were or not, was a condemnation. It was a sign one way or the other. So they really didn't have a choice but to act. And if they were going to, some decided they would be loud and vocal because they were damned if they did or damned if they didn't.
And so,
Um,
yeah.
Well, no, I mean, on two fronts, this is a topic that I think about a lot. One, especially, is in reference to HUAC and the Red Scare and everything, which is that it was a complicated time, but you know, you do it's like with an Oppenheimer. If you just do any research, like I read a book on the making of High Noon a few years ago that gets into HUAC and how there was a lot of cases where it's like, well, we were fighting the Nazis and we were teamed with the communists, with the Soviets for 5-6 years, and then all of a sudden it was bad that I did that, and now I can't say, well, I was that for a few years, but I wasn't after a while because the political climate at the time, and also just the idea of an informer in an Italian American household is one of a complex discussion because one, yeah, snitching, you inherently like you don't want someone in your inner circle to snitch on you because it's a breach of trust and confidence and all that, but with it, then you just start thinking about it of like, okay, well, then how do you like really nail some criminals? How do you break the mafia? How do you break any of these organizations? You need people, even if they're bad guys who have done many bad things. Sammy the Bull Gravano might be the most famous example of this. A guy who was a horrible killer, did all sorts of bad shit, but he ratted on Gotti, and that pretty much was the domino effect that essentially wiped out the mafia from any sort of power to really fear in America in the 90s and on. And it also makes you, anybody who inherently says, snitches get stitches or, whatever shit like that, you have to really take some context into account too, because how did Me Too happen? Me Too only happens because women started to snitch on their bosses or guys they used to work for or people they were currently working on. What's a snitch? Like someone that, hey, like, don't go out with this guy because a lot of the girls I know have said he's done bad things. Don't go out with him. It's things like that. So, yeah,
Have you ever heard of a guy named Whittaker Chambers?
No.
We're going to talk about him, and I want to just get to his statements on, because the notable figure and his commentary on being an informer, I think, is really going to resonate with you in particular. So I'll just continue from here. It's abundantly clear with any research that knowing how to proceed ethically in at least the beginning of the era of the Red Scare, a period where the U.S. government was investigating possible Soviet subversive acts within the country, was not as apparent as the benefit of hindsight allows us to cast it as. In Victor S. Navasky's excellent book Naming Names, he attempts to dispel the entirely negative connotation now attached to the concept of informer, noting, quote, "By calling people informers, I do not mean to convert the presumption against naming names into an absolute prohibition. In principle, there may be circumstances where informing is the right thing to do, even as there may be circumstances where lying or murder, in self-defense, for instance, or in fighting a just war, is the right thing to do." In that same introductory chapter, however, Navasky illustrates that just because an informer knew their cause was just doesn't mean their decision was not difficult. And to do that, he invokes Whittaker Chambers, author of the influential anti-communist book Witness. Chambers was a devoted communist in the earlier part of his life, beginning as a sympathetic author and, according to his own testimony, ultimately serving as a spy for the GRU, working with an underground cell of secret communists in Washington, D.C. However, Chambers broke with the party in 1938 in reaction to Stalin's Great Purge of 1937, an irrefutable piece of proof for those incapable of willing themselves into total denial that the communist ideals that the Soviet Union sympathizers had bought into could hardly spread across the Pacific to their nation if it didn't even truly exist within the USSR. With the benefit of hindsight, of course, we can see that what became of HUAC and the hyperbole of Joseph McCarthy and draw parallels between that and the show trials of the Stalin regime. But to do so too broadly runs the risk of sacrificing any recognition of the degrees of severity in favor of the binary good and bad absent any nuance. And perhaps surprisingly for an observer today, the infamous informer Whittaker Chambers did not view things in such a binary. though he stated his intention was to immobilize the Communist Party and, if possible, smash it. That's his quote. He did not take the act of informing lightly. To quote Navasky, rather, Chambers, like HUAC, seemed to argue that informing was the inevitable hell through which the ex-communist must pass on his road back to self-respect and redemption, and names were the bullets with which the ex-communist might slay the Red Dragon. Now, before we go any further, I want to give Chambers a chance to speak to himself, and so I'd love to get your guys' response to what Chambers himself said about being an informer in Witness. To be an informer, men shrink from that word and what it stands for as from something lurking and poisonous. Spy is a different breed of word. Espionage is a function of war, whether it be waged between nations, classes, or parties. Like the soldier, his acts are largely impersonal. He seldom knows whom he cripples or kills. Spy as an epithet is a convention of morale. The enemy's spy is always monstrous. Our spy is daring and brave. It must be so, since all camps use spies, and must while war lasts. The informer is different, particularly the ex-communist informer. He risks little. He sits in security and uses his special knowledge to destroy others. He has that special information to give because he knows those others' faces, voices, and lives, because he once lived within their confidence in a shared faith, trusted by them as one of themselves, accepting their friendship, feeling their pleasures and griefs, sitting in their houses, eating at their tables, accepting their kindness, knowing their wives and children. If he had not done these things, he would have no use as an informer. Absent context, this reads like the most bitter and righteous condemnation from someone who refused to name names. It reads like the kind of tirade you would have heard in the lobby of Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in 1999, shouted by one of those grizzled old veteran screenwriters who refused to clap when Elia Kazan got his honorary Oscar. But it isn't. It's the words of the most famous ex-communist informant in mid-century America, a man who went on to become a conservative icon alongside William F. Buckley at the National Review, a man whose best-selling confessional Witness is credited as the book that shifted a young Ronald Wilson Reagan from a New Deal Democrat to a conservative Republican. As FBI files released through FOIA decades later revealed, while outwardly defending his colleagues in the Screen Actors Guild, for which he was president at the time, Reagan was secretly providing information on supposed communist subversives to the FBI. So while we know Reagan read Chambers' words about the deep moral weight of becoming an informer, it becomes more difficult to determine if those words had any impact on the future president of the United States. So that's what I wanted to get into with Chambers and informant. I really wanted to get your guys' thoughts on what Chambers was saying here about. Obviously, we're going to be talking about a film made by somebody who refused to name names, but I wanted to just get your thoughts on what Chambers said about the moral weight of naming names.
Well, the moral weight of naming names is, again, it's like it was a whole complicated situation because, there were guys that were true believers that were called up and still named names because they were afraid of the consequences to lay upon themselves. There were guys that were called up that weren't true believers and named names just because they thought it was the right thing to do, and also to, save some face. It's what I think he's getting at, especially when he, describes like the difference between a spy and an informer and all that, is really just that the wording can change how you view something, but also the intent behind something can do something. And it's the informer tag is the one that really always gets to people, because it's like being called a rat. It has a level of, you have to have a level of connection to the source that you are informing upon. It's not a case of like being a spy where you're inserted into something and have to fake these connections or what have you. Being an informer means you were there on your own accord and you still decided for whatever reason, which again shows that there is no one simple answer to what an informer is and what their moral positioning or standing is that at the only thing that really binds all of the different ways you can describe an informer is that they had to give up people that they knew. They had to have really betray is kind of the word that you got to think about here. Whether, again, and that's the thing that gets you tripped up with informing or snitching or what have you, which is that nobody wants to be informed on, nobody wants to be snitched on. And especially in this case, because in a lot of ways, the people getting snitched on weren't really doing anything. They weren't doing anything wrong, which doubles the pain of what the informer is doing to them, even if the informer may think they were doing something wrong or had done it or were currently doing it. But for the most part, when someone's informing on you, it's because you've done something to be informed upon. I don't. Hey, listen. If I'm dating someone and I'm cheating, and someone tells my girlfriend that, hey, I have another girlfriend, I don't want them to do that. That person would be dead to me. But at the same point, yeah, I don't want them to inform because I know I'm gonna get in fucking trouble. So, yeah, I think he kind of gets, shockingly enough, seems to be a talented fella, that he was able to understand that words matter, words have meanings, but they could also have multiple meanings in different contexts. And yeah,
I will
right
say
on, brother.
I don't necessarily think that one side has it easier than the other. I think from the spy side, trying to integrate yourself within and not staying connected is equally as difficult as the inverse of being invested, maybe being so tightly wounded in whether it's a criminal organization or communist organization in this case, and then electing to unwind yourself from that into essentially a moral net neutral. So I do think they both have their struggles to it. I think it is far less. I think it's far harder to be an active informant because I don't think it's necessarily as easy as just sitting by. You are actively making the choice of betrayal, and you don't necessarily know what the consequences of that could be.
I also, I want to jump to Tom. You mentioned the idea of ratting somebody out. I'm going to divert from the script if it's okay with you guys. There's a part of Navasky's book that I didn't include in the script, but you talking about it, I want you to I want to give you this information in a way. I'm just going to read this paragraph here. The writer-director Abraham Polanski, a former communist who was an unapologetic Fifth Amendment invoking witness, explains the actor John Garfield's refusal to name names in terms that make it clear the importance of the informer or stool pigeon label. And this, I'm reading from Navasky's book here, but this is the quote from Polanski. He said he hated communists. He hated communism. He was an American. He told the committee what it wanted to hear, but he wouldn't say the one thing that would keep him from walking down his old neighborhood block. Nobody could say, hey, there's that fucking stool pigeon. You see, that's what he was fighting against. He should be a stool pigeon because he can only gain from it. Yet he can't do it because in his mind, he lives in the street where he comes from. And in the street he comes from, you're not a stool pigeon. That's the ultimate horror. I just thought, I truly, as you were saying that, Tom, but you don't want to be a rat, and especially earlier when we were saying about Italian American communities and all of that. It just, even though I didn't include it in the script, it just jumped to me that I was like, well, that's also in here, and I wanted to just kind of pull that up from that. I thought that would be.
Well, it really is truly the case. Like, John Garfield kind of feels the way that a lot of guys feel even today, which is, I know something's wrong, I know this is that, but and I will say vigorously, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, but I'm not going to tell you who's doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, the old neighborhoods, filled with guys that weren't involved in the life, saw plenty of evidence of guys in the life doing things in the life, but would never say anything to the cops if the cops came around. I mean, look at The Wire or any cop show in the last 25 years that tries to be as realistic as they can. And that anytime, a murder case happens in a poor neighborhood, everybody was, 100 people saw the murder, but not one person saw who shot them, shot the guy. It's like, yeah, because if anybody around here knows that I talked, I'm fucked. Yeah. You may think more. That's the thing. Morally, it may be the right thing to do, but the reality of life is sometimes our morals don't really help us make it to the next day, internally or externally. There is a thing of, I may not, with my principles, feel like informing on people is the right thing, but you know, it's just this whole thing of like, yeah, you may be worried about the people on the outside. John Garfield doesn't want to walk down the street, and people say it's fucking stool pigeon. But there's also a case of some people are so ingrained with that idea that if you get pushed to the limit and you do name names, because it's like literally, if you don't do this, you're fucked no matter what. No, who cares what the guys on the street are saying? You're never going to work again. You're going to be a pauper the rest of your life. And it goes, all right, well, I'm going to do it, but oh god, I'm going to live the rest of my life fucking drinking myself to sleep because I remembered what I did.
Well, that's what I want to, in this second part here. This is what I want to examine from another angle. I bring up Chambers' words and Navasky's not to entirely exonerate those who named names during the infamous HUAC hearings against Hollywood. It's crucial to remember that there is a marked difference between those who testified against those suspected of governmental espionage and those pointing the finger at Hollywood. This is something you alluded to earlier, Tom.
Yeah.
The people innocent. There is a marked difference between testifying against someone you suspect of sneaking national security secrets to foreign nations, which inarguably puts lives at risk and threatens the safety of the nation, and testifying against those allegedly implanting anti-American ideas into works of art, even if those ideas are being put forth at the request of a foreign government. Rather, I bring up their words to emphasize that when making the decision of how to act before HUAC, this decision was not easy. It was not easy. It seems easy now, when the general narrative around the Red Scare is that it was a witch hunt, no doubt due to Arthur Miller's metaphorical masterwork, The Crucible, where 15th century Salem weaponized the non-existent threat of witches to escalate petty grievances into brutal acts of revenge. But doing so runs the risk of suggesting that, much as there were no witches in Salem, there were no communist spies in the U.S. Indeed, that became the narrative in the decades after. Top of the list of those evoked as martyrs destroyed by America's Cold War paranoia were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, a New York-born Jewish couple who were executed by the federal government in 1953 after being convicted of supplying top-secret military information to the Soviet Union, including nuclear secrets. I assume you guys are both... you've heard the names Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, at the very least, right? You're familiar with with some aspects.
I'm not actually, no.
Oh, you've never heard of Julius? Okay, they are
No, genuinely,
very they were mid-century American martyrs, and I want to talk about. So they were accused and convicted of smuggling out secrets, including American nuclear secrets, to the Soviet Union, and they were executed for it in 1953. And this caused an international uproar. And I want to talk about that for a second. Their conviction led to public outcry as the Rosenbergs were viewed as innocents, swept up in government overreach in the midst of anti-communist paranoia. French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called what was happening to the Rosenbergs a legal lynching. Many focused on the religion of the Rosenbergs, suggesting anti-Semitism may have been a driving force in why these two Americans were supposedly falsely convicted of espionage, with W.E.B. Du Bois writing, "Crucify us, vengeance of God, as we crucify two more Jews." Now, there's two things about that. I'm jumping off script for a second. There's two things about that stuck out to me. One is obviously thinking about the Rosenbergs and how they're being treated in a similar way to like Sacco and Vanzetti were treated. Now, Kyle, I don't know. Do you know the name Sacco and Vanzetti?
Nope, I do not.
If even as far removed as we are, like people Tom and I are from quote unquote the old country, if you grow up in an Italian American household, you know the name Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian anarchists who a lot of people believe were falsely accused of murder and were executed. And it was a cause of uproar at the time because America was full of anti-immigrant and anti-Italian sentiment. And Sacco and Vanzetti kind of exist as Tom and I often like to evoke examples of anti-Italian discrimination in America in history. And we often laugh about it Tom certainly
Yeah.
likes to make jokes about that because it's
Yeah.
funny in hindsight because of how much we've just kind of, permeated the culture now. But like, that is a thing that, especially if you talk to, and I'm sure, Tom, you can speak to this too. Like, if you talk about Sacco and Vanzetti, especially with somebody like our grandparents' age, you're not going to get any laughter. Like, that's a real serious thing that happened. And it got like passed down through the generations of this idea of like, they killed us for being wops, basically.
Is this Italian? Is this the Italian equivalent of Michael Brown?
It's just the fact that it was like a big. It was it's hard to describe because it ties into a period.
It's just one of the many examples of this country just killing someone of a different group that we don't deem the right kind or part of the majority. Yeah, Michael Brown, Emmett Till, whatever you want to put it in, it's just. Yeah.
I would say the difference between those, and the reason I wouldn't necessarily totally equate them, is just the fact that the idea, we live in a country where there is still racial violence towards a lot of minority groups. The reason Sacco and Vanzetti gets brought up, I think, from elders that we would talk to, is the idea of like, the idea of men being killed for the quote unquote crime of being Italian sounds insane now, right? Like if you heard somebody saying like they picked those guys up, they put them in the chair just because they're Italian, you'd be like, well, this is InfoWars. Like, this is insane. Like, this doesn't have, and it's a thing that gets brought up in the sense of like, especially again by the mid-century and by a little later, like, it's a thing that like again, Tom and I laugh about old-time anti-Italian discrimination because it seems so absurd now. Sacco and Vanzetti isn't even a thing you can laugh at because it's just knowing that hatred was so strong, and somehow the fact that hatred doesn't exist anymore, that it's so diluted, makes the crime so much more jarring. Right? It feels like, we talk about like, obviously you hear about the horrific crimes that have happened to people in this country for whom, like, horrific crimes are still happening to indigenous people and people of color within this country. When you find out about Sacco and Vanzetti, it's almost like finding out somebody goes, well, at one point in time in this country, we hated left-handed people so much we killed 2 of them. It's just like, what do you mean? That doesn't make sense. So I say all that to say the Rosenbergs were a cause célèbre at the time. Like I said, I'm evoking, and the idea of them being killed because of anti-Semitism, the W.E.B. Du Bois quote. The other thing that struck me about that when I was doing my research on that was just thinking that W.E.B. Du Bois was alive to write about the Rosenbergs.
Yeah, right.
That sounds weird, right? That sounds wrong.
Yeah.
That sounds like, I had to double check when I was reading. So I'm like, that can't be right. And I look, it was like 10 years before he died. So in any event, people were, the Rosenbergs were viewed as innocents swept up in government overreach. You even see the Rosenbergs represented in Angels in America as ghosts haunting Roy Cohn. But let me continue. That the Rosenbergs were likely innocent became such legend printed as fact that it has yet to permeate some circles that in 1995, decoded Soviet messages collected during the U.S. Army's 37-year-long Venona project revealed that Julius Rosenberg had indeed been a Soviet spy smuggling secrets, and that his wife Ethel had been his loyal aide, going so far as to have supposedly typed the missives he would deliver. Similarly,
no way.
Yes. Yeah. Like my whole life, even decades after the Venona Project came out, I always was taught and came to understand that the Rosenbergs were likely innocent. That the Rosenbergs were victims of a communist witch hunt. But they have the documents. And so similarly, while I loved Victor S. Navasky's book Naming Names, it was published in 1981. And therefore comes from a vantage point of uncertainty about the guilt of one of the men Whittaker Chambers informed on, U.S. State Department official Alger Hiss, who was instrumental in the founding of the United Nations And Alger Hiss was even at the Yalta Conference between Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill. Alger Hiss was testified against by Whittaker Chambers. And often when you hear about the era of McCarthyism and these comments about high-ranking government officials as communist spies, that's a thing we point to as purely McCarthy's paranoia. Alger Hiss was a name that was famous because they said he was a communist, and obviously his life was destroyed by these accusations. And then in the decades since, we looked at Alger Hiss and went, oh, well, he was set up. But Alger Hiss's name appears in the decoded missives from the Venona Project, so much so that in 1998, Democratic Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, head of the Moynihan Commission on Government Secrecy, declared that Hiss was indeed a Soviet agent and appears to have been regarded by Moscow as its most important. So I stress again, calling it all a witch hunt to make it a game of good guys and bad guys can trick us into thinking that there was not any Soviet infiltration in the U.S.
Well, yeah, I mean that's the main thing is that everything gets so simplified over time, and it's that we only think of the HUAC era as, you know, this jerk off McCarthy going against Hollywood because, well, it was good publicity for him and he got on TV and blah, blah, blah. And he made a name for himself and tried to parlay that into more power. And he failed and looked like an asshole, but, you know, he destroyed a lot of people's lives. But yes, there were Soviet spies in America because that's just what countries do. We insert spies into other nations. And yeah, sometimes, you know, life is a little more complex than a lot of people online would like you to think it is.
And I want to note with that, as we're acknowledging there were these Soviet spies, and I took a look at the Venona Project documents as best I could. And I want to note that while the Venona Project vindicates some of America's Red Scare panic, it is also crucial to note that I could not find, within the myriad of information released from a 37-year espionage effort, any mention of any of the names among the famous Hollywood 10. Alva Bessie, Herbert J. Biberman, Lester Cole, Edward Dmytryk, Ring Lardner Jr., John Howard Lawson, Albert Maltz, Samuel Ornitz, Adrian Scott, and Dalton Trumbo. Could not find any of them within that. So I think it's important to also note that.
Yeah, I mean,
so I'm curious. So and maybe you had said it and I misheard. Was the public opinion around the Rosenbergs so strong that they were innocent that when eventually it was discovered that they were indeed spies, like it was just too late, or was it sort of just we're gonna take a crack at it and hope we got it right, and they just happened to be right?
You mean, what are you asking, if the government knew that they
correct?
were?
Like with confidently.
So the government knew.
So they knew.
The Venona Project was an ongoing act of espionage and decoding messages. They did not release to the public the Venona Project papers until after the fall of the Soviet Union, right? So the government was not giving us that information, right? Because to do so would expose the fact that we were decoding these messages, right? And that would blow it. But there were a lot of people who got swept up in the Red Scare. And there were, and we will talk about, there were more people destroyed for no reason during the Red Scare than there were actual communist spies. That is not in question. My contention, in a way, when I look at the Red Scare, and I think will become clearer even as I go through more of this, is the fact that too often it gets reduced to this idea of you start with, they did not find any communist spies during the HUAC hearings against Hollywood, to there were no communist sympathizers in Hollywood, to there were no communists infiltrating the U.S. government. And it's not until the 90s when we find out Alger Hiss is there. The Rosenbergs did it. And by that point, we had consumed so much media and so much content that leaned into the idea of the Rosenbergs' innocence, that somebody, and I'm not saying my father in particular, right? I'm just going to say somebody my father's age has so internalized, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend, has so internalized that angle of the Rosenbergs. A baby boomer has so internalized that idea of the Rosenbergs that it doesn't matter what the new information is. It's just not going to pierce that. It's the same way, like if you talk to somebody, and again, I'm not saying any of our fathers, but if you talk to, a man in his 50s, a baby boomer, type of person, they're still regurgitating this idea that got spit out a lot post 9/11 that, well, Bill Clinton had the opportunity to take out bin Laden and he didn't. Right? Like you hear that constantly from these guys. Like, and they go so far as to say there's this scenario where like we got him in our sights and Bill Clinton was like, don't shoot at him. I'm sure he's a good guy. And it's like that's not true. Or at least that's a very, when you dig down to like where that story came from, it's a much more complicated thing. But it has just been regurgitated so much that it doesn't matter what the truth is anymore. It just doesn't matter. And I think that's an element of the Rosenberg thing.
You know what's I think honestly doesn't help in this regard with the way people view HUAC and that entire era is that, not spilling anything unique here, Hollywood is very self-interested.
Mm-hmm.
So for decades, any discussion about that era in time was about how horrible it was and how they were going after these innocent writers and actors and all this. And it was a witch hunt and it was all this. And yes, from your guys' side, it clearly was just a PR scheme by Joseph McCarthy. But by spending all of this time making movie after movie after movie that said the Red Scare was bullshit, you're going to start getting people to think there was no other side to that coin, which was they weren't just looking for actors. This one jerk-off might have been looking at actors and screenwriters and directors or whatever, but this was a thing that was actually happening and actually had effects on governmental things.
I mean,
like
it's there, and I think the thing is like there's a difference between the beginning of the Red Scare and the end of the Red Scare, right? There's a difference between, and I think one of the things that I found troubling the more I read up on this, and I've read a couple of books, Show Trial. I'm forgetting the author's name now. I'll include it in the show notes. Is another excellent work on this, and obviously, again, Navasky's book is invaluable. I can't recommend that enough, even though, like I said, it's from '81, so it's a little dated. But I think one of the things that is very striking as you look into this, and what I get into in kind of the part 3, the final part of this little script here, one of the things that is striking about the Red Scare and HUAC and how all that unfolds is that it becomes a little bit, in a way, it destroyed so many innocent lives, and you look at it and go, this never should have happened. How did it get here? And the more you read about the early stages of the Red Scare, I think it is hard not to see 5, 6, 7 spots where different things failed and allowed this thing to snowball. It's a little bit like, and I'll continue reading in a second, but reading it is a little bit like, if there was an active shooter situation, right? And obviously, the government's paranoia, and people like Joseph McCarthy, this is the guy with the gun, right? Or I shouldn't say active shooter. This is the guy holding a gun, right? The guy walks into a bank holding a gun. Or a guy walks in and he's threatening somebody with a gun on the subway, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a guy pulls a gun on the subway. If 15, 16, 17 people are dead, when you're looking at the tape, you have to question, like, what happened here that it escalated to that? And to question how it escalated is not in any way to exonerate the gunman, right? But there is a reason why when a guy comes in with a loaded gun, people who are trained in these situations don't act like the people who think they know what they do. The people who think they know what they do And make it worse, they're fucking Ellis from Die Hard. They're the guy who says, like, I'm going to stand up and tell this person, sir, you're not going to do this, and I'll wrestle a gun from his hand. And now you got a guy who may have just shot one person, now he's shooting 15. And the people who are trained for this know how to de-escalate. And when you watch the people who are trained to de-escalate, it's not satisfying. And I want us to maybe keep that in mind as we take a look at the earliest part of the HUAC hearing and what leads us into this film we're talking about today. Were there communists in Hollywood in the first half of the 20th century? Absolutely. Many. That's not in question. But that's not the same as whether there were any Soviet spies or subversives. In fact, by the 1940s, when the Soviet Union was seen as an ally against the Nazis, as you alluded to earlier, Tom, those who were attending pro-communist meetings thought they were doing their patriotic duty. Only later would those who joined up with the Reds before America joined up with the Allies be labeled as prematurely fascist. Hey everybody, Mike from the future. I correct myself in a few seconds into this speech here, but I just wanted to jump in and make sure I addressed the term was prematurely anti-fascist. I misspoke here, but I get it right in the next sentence or so, but I just wanted to make sure that was clear. The label was prematurely anti-fascist. So if you were interested in communism or just anti-fascism pre-Pearl Harbor, you were then labeled prematurely anti-fascist. So why did communism first rise in Hollywood? Because a bunch of capitalists got mad. That's why. The Great Depression hit everywhere in America and belts were tightened, but Hollywood had been able to weather the financial hardships okay. We've talked plenty of times in the show before about how a trip to the cinema helped many regular Americans endure the economic downturn. But while those ticket sales meant money was flowing to Hollywood, it didn't flow to all the artists equally. As Karina Longworth noted in her miniseries The Blacklist for her podcast You Must Remember This, that money largely went to bonuses for the studio heads. Collectives like the Screen Actors Guild and the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, now SAG-AFTRA, the Directors Guild, and the Writers Guild, formed to try and get a more equitable share of the profits from the studios. Many of the people who formed these guilds simply wanted a fair shake within the capitalist system of Hollywood. But there were inarguably people who were not just card-carrying members of the Communist Party, but vocal advocates of the Soviet lifestyle. Some saw the potential of the American Communist Party as a prominent third option alongside Democrats and Republicans, in the vein of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they would note. But undoubtedly, a handful looked more towards Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin. It is the presence of this latter, arguably subversive sect that studio heads began blaming for the collective action they were seeing on their lots. Walt Disney, for example, blamed the 1941 animators' strike at his studio on the actions of communist subversives, as opposed to a reasonable reaction to the studio's bizarre and obtuse distribution of profits. To divert a second, that is a thing. Disney went to his grave thinking the communist agitators had caused the strike on his lot. And while it is true that there were communists and even communist agitators in Hollywood, you talk to the animators that were there and they will tell you, no, it's just that Walt would just randomly pay people. That you didn't know what the guy next to you was making, because the allocations of bonuses, the allocations of even salaries could sometimes just be, well, I like this guy and I don't like this guy. And it gets attributed to these communist agitators. And maybe the loudest guy in the room was. I don't know. But the outcome of that is, yeah.
It just reminds me of, we all grew up hearing from our parents, the older you get, the more conservative you're going to become. And that has not become true for most of our generation, because our generation, as has been in many a study and all those sorts of reports, are the first generation to be worse off than their parents. Mm-hmm. And I think that gets to like what you're saying about, yes, why so many people in Hollywood became communists or communist sympathizers or starting the unions, blah, 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 is, yeah, once you realize you're not well off and kind of getting fucked by the people with the actual money, you start getting a little bit, hey, give me my fair fucking share, guy. Mm-hmm. And it's not until you become one of those people that maybe a little bit, yeah, you become a little more conservative once you have enough money that you don't want to ever lose it and not be comfortable anymore. It's really just a case of, are you comfortable or are you not? Because if you're not comfortable, you're probably getting fucked over by the people that are comfortable.
But I would argue it goes a little beyond that, and that's something we're going to explore here, because obviously you have a lot of people in the 30s who are, Hollywood communist or communist sympathizers who get very conservative after that. I already evoked, and I will evoke again, Ronald Reagan being the quintessential example. I think another element of this, even look at, somebody like John Reed, right? John Reed, one of the founders of the American Communist Party, the man who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World. There is no more American communist than John Reed. And as you see depicted in Beatty's Reds and all that, the disillusionment Reed felt when, there's that old adage you hear from a lot of old conservative people, a liberal's a conservative who hasn't been mugged yet. And that's bullshit. But what it really is, I think in some senses, is I think, you see people drift away from that. And I wouldn't say become more conservative as they're older, but drift away is when you get taken in by somebody. When you get taken in by somebody who expresses ideals and doesn't match them. And you see that Whittaker Chambers is a perfect example. That is a dyed-in-the-wool communist. That man was spying for the Soviet Union. And then Stalin's Great Purge made him an anti-communist, made him an informer, because he looked at that and went, wait a minute. I was willing to back you up on this because you promised me it wasn't going to be like this.
Yeah.
Because you told me. So I want to get into that. But with any of these arguably reasonable reactions to corporate greed, we can't entirely rule out the presence of Soviet involvement in these actions. There were communists present in these guilds at the time. There were likely Soviet-friendly figures at a lot of these protests. But that didn't mean they had power. That's just where they go, where they congregate, hoping to get a foothold. It's no different than when a rally gets formed to discuss an international humanitarian crisis, for example, or income inequality in America, and a guy shows up with a Nazi tattoo waving a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The majority of that crowd don't agree with that guy and would kick him out if they heard him. They're just too caught up in their own chants to notice him, especially if he's chanting their words right along with them. But once a news reporter gives him a microphone and lets him talk as part of the crowd, that guy has fucked it up for everyone. In the eyes of the viewers at home, that's now a Nazi rally. And I think that's crucial to understand when we talk about the Red Scare and what happens. And there's some anecdotes I'm going to get into in a second about exactly how that happens. But this idea of, you hear that adage a lot of, if you don't kick the Nazi out of your bar soon, it's a Nazi bar, right?
Yeah.
We've seen it. I don't want to speak to everybody's political activism. I'll speak to my past own, which also indicates why my present own is not quite as active. But when you go to demonstrations, when you go to rallies, if you are not very quick to kick out the Nazis, if you are not very quick to kick out the creeps and the weirdos who are latching themselves onto what is ostensibly left-wing causes, somebody's going to put a microphone in front of them. Somebody's going to fuck it up for all of you. And that is a crucial thing to remember. If you're a group that is all going, yeah, we're New Deal Democrats, we are not communists, we do not work for Stalin, and then you find out that somebody has been getting telegrams from the Kremlin, you're all fucked by that. Every one of you is fucked by that. And I think that is crucial to remember. So let's take it in and talk about how this all came together. On July 29th, 1946, William R. Wilkerson, publisher and founder of The Hollywood Reporter, published an op-ed called A Vote for Joe Stalin, which sought to call out communist sympathizers in Hollywood, naming among them Lester Cole, Ring Lardner Jr., John Howard Lawson, and Dalton Trumbo. On October of 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee used that Hollywood Reporter article to create a list of entertainment industry figures to subpoena in order to determine if communist agents were being employed to intentionally implant pro-Soviet or anti-American propaganda in Hollywood movies. Walt Disney was a friendly witness in front of HUAC and made his beliefs clear about the communist influence causing his animator strike. It was an animator strike, I should say. In a muted version of the friendly testimony, in contrast to his private betrayals, SAG President Ronald Reagan attested that while there was a small clique within his union that employed communist-like tactics to try and sway union policy, he could not attest whether the members of that clique, who he did not name publicly, were members of the Communist Party or not, and he felt he had them under control. To read Reagan's testimony alone, these subversives within SAG at the time sound less like a villain from a James Bond film and more like those annoying guys in 2016 who were trying to organize a mass fart-in protest at the DNC out of a belief that Bernie Sanders could still win the nomination. But, and this is something I think you'll find interesting, especially Tom, because I don't think you know about this particular little nugget here. Many big names in Hollywood were opposed to the way the government intended to interrogate the men that would be known as the Hollywood 10 for their alleged political allegiances. Directors John Huston and William Wyler, along with actress Myrna Loy and screenwriter Philip Dunn, formed a group called the Committee for the First Amendment, which sought to protest the actions of HUAC. Have you come across anything about this Committee for the First Amendment? I find this so interesting. Its membership boasted some of the biggest stars of the time, including Danny Kaye, Sterling Hayden, Gene Kelly, Judy Garland, and most famously of all, Humphrey Bogart. The committee saw some of their fellow artists being unfairly accused by a government hell-bent on railroading them, trying to equate espousing the views of a patriotic New Deal Democrat with being a subversive member of the Communist Party. And Kyle, you as a history buff and a presidential history buff, I think that's important context for you to keep in mind too, is that a lot of these people were New Deal Democrats. And when FDR was president, his opponents were accusing him of being a socialist. So a lot of people at the time saw the Red Scare as an attempt by right-wingers to try and undo the policies of the New Deal, which they did in a lot of cases, like the WPA. But it would have been very easy if you were a New Deal Democrat to hear somebody saying, well, you're all communists, and be like, no, we're not. Ronald Reagan, still a New Deal Democrat himself at the time, called the group one of the most successful operations in the communist domestic history, calling his fellow liberals suckers for buying into it. And unfortunately, in this one instance, and arguably only this one instance, Reagan was right. Because those who joined the committee so vocally, like Bogart, did so with the assurance that the 10 men called before Congress were not actually communists, and more crucially, that nobody in the Committee for the First Amendment was a communist, so as not to leave them open to attacks about their intentions. They wanted to be able to say, we are New Deal Democrats. We do not have communists here. Sterling Hayden, for example, had directly given Bogart his assurance that he was not a communist. But when the hearings made clear that Hollywood 10 members like Trumbo and Lawson were well-known Communist Party members, and an article in a newspaper exposed that Sterling Hayden was a party member as well, Bogart was infuriated. When he returned to Hollywood after the hearings, he reportedly shouted at Danny Kaye, "You fuckers sold me out." The committee quickly folded, and its membership all distanced itself, claiming they were duped. And what that means is what could have been a major force for allyship at the start of the HUAC hearings, before they had snowballed, that bridge was now burned. The Hollywood 10, of course, had their own idea for how to fight back against HUAC. They would not name names, but they would also not invoke their right to remain silent under the Fifth Amendment. This is what I was raised to understand. When I was first learning about the HUAC hearing in the Hollywood 10, in the very simplified versions I heard, it was just Fifth Amendment, right? That's how we talked about it, especially because that burned people later. It is an oft-repeated misconception that they simply pled the Fifth. It could be argued that their careers would have still been damaged by pleading the Fifth, as many who did so in front of HUAC similarly suffered. But we won't know, because instead, in true Hollywood fashion, the Hollywood 10 chose to make a show of it. They chose instead to refuse to testify on the basis of the First Amendment, expressing within the hearing that the very act of calling them to testify violated their rights to free speech and free assembly. Not only did the Hollywood 10 refuse to answer the questions of this Un-American committee, many wrote speeches in which they read, decrying the committee for just how goddamn un-American it was. Rather than stay silent, these men made clear they would not go quietly. They would cause a scene. They would make their statement. They would take their principled stand. These men, if they were going to go down, they would go down swinging. Unfortunately, there was collateral damage amidst that Donnybrook. These men and many others after them were blacklisted by the film industry, who had now become terrified of being seen as harboring subversives. After all, this had moved from mere questioning of communist sympathies. The Hollywood 10 had been convicted of contempt of Congress, which led to jail times and fines. So, before I close out, I just, I kind of wanted to, before I talk about some of these Hollywood 10 and where they wound up, like, I just wanted to close out with both of y'all's thoughts on this period, I guess, and the idea of, like, talking about the idea of this committee for the First Amendment and the decision by Trumbo and others to evoke the First Amendment and make the stand. I don't think any of us can question the courage that it took to make those statements, and to take that stand. Just like I don't think any of us can question the courage of even forming the committee for the First Amendment. I mean, nobody here is going to call John Huston a coward. I think we're all afraid his skeleton would rise up and hit us if we did. But,
Yeah.
To go back to what I alluded to before about the guy with the loaded gun on a train, there is a question of escalation, and I always look at that committee for the First Amendment and wonder how much differently things might have gone down had that committee not been collapsed as quickly as it was. And the question that raises, and I want to get your thoughts, like, is it cowardice that the committee for the First Amendment collapsed, or is it a case of this could only work if nobody lied? This could only work if we could say we did not harbor communists. So I
I mean, it really is just the thing where it's just, I think everything is just too complicated for any really sort of simple answer, because on one hand, it's cowardice that the First Amendment group kind of collapsed because, well, if you guys just kind of stuck to it and said maybe you guys could have pushed through it, but then there's a self-preservation aspect to it. Maybe they saw the writing on the wall of, well, we're being lied to, so how can we trust these guys? And that's going to make them look bad in general. And now you have the 10. Instead of doing the Fifth Amendment, they're going to make a fucking show out of all this and turn it into a show about themselves and show how great they are and what great writers and orators and public speakers they are, and turn it into basically turn it into a media spectacle. And maybe not everybody, but I'm sure some of them, and definitely the studio heads, were like, this is now going to become a PR battle, and we're not going to win the PR battle no matter how much solidarity we show, because communism's the boogeyman now. For whatever reason, there's history is so complicated, but for whatever reason, what was the good guys 10 years ago are the bad guys now. The people in this country are so fucking spooked by just saying the word communist that you lose the case the first second someone says communist. You kind of just screwed no matter what. And then, yeah, I mean, the 10, if they did the fifth, would they have been as penalized as harshly? Probably not. But then you maybe think, well, maybe they would get penalized as the first, dissenters. Oh, you guys aren't giving us answers. Well, fuck you. You're gonna go to jail. It's just fucking, dude, communists make everything so fucking difficult, man. It's like, I'm not inherently saying I am a communist or a capitalist. I think there are ways to kind of merge a bunch of different ideas, but it's when you start talking to the like actual communists and they start going like, well, yeah, do you know what the home ownership rate is in Cuba? And I go, yeah, do you know why?
Well, it's
Do,
like
do, do you know why a lot of Cubans don't have extended families?
it's why I loved, and I'm not trying to jump in, but it's why I don't like the movie, but I do love the ending of Hail Caesar being these dipshit screenwriters. And I say this, given our work, but these dipshit writers who are like, well, we're gonna we're so smart. And the Soviets love us, and we're going to raise all this money. And then Channing Tatum basically just takes the money into a sub, and nothing comes of it.
Yeah.
And it's like, anyway, I'm sorry, Kyle.
I mean, we've made connections to this with Me Too, and I feel like I'm feeling a lot of similarities with there as well. I mean, we obviously look at the people who organized the Me Too movement. I think that has somewhat dissolved. That leadership had gone through its own set of controversy, but to suggest that what came beforehand and people like Harvey Weinstein that are still facing trial for the shit that they've committed and everything, to say that was a failure simply because the figureheads that put it into motion had their own stuff, I think would be disingenuous. So,
well, I think with that though, and if I may just offer kind of, I think the question with, I don't think that to question either the tactics of Dalton Trumbo or the Committee for the First Amendment or anything, to question that is not to condemn opposing HUAC. We should all oppose HUAC. I think what it boils down to in some ways, HUAC was fucking bad. It was bad. It was bad from the fucking start, right? I think what it boils down to in some ways is it's similar to, how do I put this? There is a question of what did everybody here do that it got as bad as it did? And I think it's okay, even if you're on the right side of an issue, right? Even if, again, to bring the loaded gun analogy, if a guy's walking around with a pistol, right, in a mall, and he shot 3 people, and you pull out your AR-15 and just start firing away, and you stopped that guy with a gun and also hit 2 other people, it's okay to take a look at that and go, it's good somebody stopped the guy, but also this could have been done in a way that did not hurt innocent people. Yeah. And I think everything you look at with the way that things went down with HUAC, what I find so horrifying and what fucks me up the more I read about it is how many lives were destroyed and how many points along the way you can look at it and see where the decisions people made, either out of cowardice or out of principle, caused a massive amount of collateral damage, not just to the people in the Hollywood 10, but to many of the people who got blacklisted after, to the spouses and families of the Hollywood 10, to a lot of people. And there are some happy endings for some of the people in the Hollywood 10, but not all of them. Some, like Dalton Trumbo, were able to find work writing under pseudonyms or using fronts. Trumbo would win 2 Academy Awards this way, the first for his script for Roman Holiday and later The Brave One. In 1970, Ring Lardner Jr. would win an Academy Award credited to him for his script for Robert Altman's MASH. Herbert J. Biberman, however, never won an Oscar. He did not work under pseudonyms. He did not use a front as a proxy to be able to collect a paycheck. What he did was see an opportunity to work outside the studio system that had blacklisted him, to make work for those who had similarly been cast out. Biberman would not get to put Audrey Hepburn on a Vespa with Gregory Peck, but he would try and represent the ideals that had apparently been so important to his fellow creatives that they had all been willing to go to jail for them. So he brought on blacklisted screenwriter Michael Wilson, blacklisted producer Paul Jericho, and blacklisted actor Will Greer, and went to New Mexico to make a film about the Empire Zinc Strike of 1951. And that film is Salt of the Earth.
Inspired by an actual miners' strike in New Mexico that lasted for more than a year, Salt of the Earth recounted major incidents in the strike. Its impact was most felt in its focus on discrimination against minorities and women. Miners' wives had been instrumental in the strike, marching in picket lines and eventually going to jail. Produced by filmmakers who had been blacklisted in Hollywood for alleged communist sympathies, the story was decidedly pro-union. Consequently, few theater owners were willing to book it. It eventually debuted in New York City to mostly positive reviews and found greater success in Europe. Its status has grown in subsequent decades, as has its influence on independent filmmakers.
So now let's talk about Salt of the Earth, the film itself. We obviously talked a lot about the run-up to it. I think before I get started, or before we get started on that, I know this is maybe a silly question, but I always ask it. Tom, Kyle, when was the first time, I know the first time you saw Salt of the Earth, but when was the first time you became aware of Salt of the Earth? Was it when we were planning out the season, or had you heard of it before?
No, it was planning out the season. Straight up, literally never heard of this thing before doing this show, and quite frankly, pretty insulted that I had to learn about this movie, giving me another reason to finally quit this goddamn show. Yeah.
You know, Tom, that just because we acknowledge its historical significance doesn't mean you can completely throw out the ethos of our podcast right away. You talk all the time when you go on other shows.
I know.
No, I just mean it's so funny because like people maybe don't know this if they don't hear your appearance on other podcasts, but it is night and day. When you're on somebody else's show plugging our show, you're like, well, it's a really great opportunity to talk positively about film, and I think we do a terrific job over there. And then you come on here like, first of all, the movie sucks. Second, I hate that I watched it. Third, I want to quit this show. Fourth, find me the hard drive all the episodes are on. I want to run it over. It's a really, it's a total.
Well, listen, it's not like you don't just go to a stranger's house, walk in, don't take your shoes off, just put your feet up on the couch, and then after a bit, you just stroll over to their refrigerator and start drinking everything and just eating their leftovers, being like, yeah, bro, yeah, thanks for having me over, man, this is fucking great. Yeah, this is fucking great, bro. Thanks for having me over. I love it. I'm gonna come over again. No, I'm home right now. I'm home. I'm not showing any of you fucks any respect. I live with you. You've dealt with this long enough. Get used to it, or you can send back the ring.
In fairness, I will just say, for people wondering how true that is, in our more than a decade of friendship, there have been... Now, listen, I want to be clear. Not all the time. Tom can be very hospitable, but there has been more than one time where Tom has walked into his kitchen, grabbed himself a full thing of dinner, sat down in front of me and went, "Did you want to go get yourself food or something?"
Hey,
more
than money on food.
Not all the time, not even most of the time, but more than once that has occurred.
Hey, just because you don't have food doesn't mean I'm not going to eat my food and then have to spend money because you're foodless. That food's there for me.
So the reason I bring that up is I was actually tangentially aware of Salt of the Earth before this podcast, simply because so the film that we're talking about today is in the public domain. It's why this film is available in full on our YouTube channel and why it's available anywhere. In 2014, I was trying to catch up on all the Oscar films, and an Oscar-nominated documentary by director Wim Wenders was called The Salt of the Earth. not Salt of the Earth, but The Salt of the Earth. And I was desperately trying to figure out where to watch this. And like, I think it was supposed to open at the Lincoln Center Cinema that is no longer there, but it wasn't supposed to open until after the Oscars. And I was desperately searching, and every time I tried to look up where to watch The Salt of the Earth, it kept kicking me back results for this 1954 film. And it was so frustrating anytime like you would just get a suggestion like, oh, I can go on this like free streaming service and watch this Wim Wenders documentary. And it was always like I'd see the first like 2 minutes of Herbert Biberman's Salt of the Earth. So I've been aware of Salt of the Earth for a while simply because of that little Wim Wenders hiccup. I've probably known about it for about a decade before we did this show. But I didn't know anything about it in terms of like I was unfamiliar with the history around it. Obviously, like, you know, we're talking about a movie that wasn't just made by blacklisted artists, but is the only movie to itself be blacklisted.
Yeah.
You know, which is remarkably significant. So we all watched this in full for the first time together, which is part of the reason we're doing this now as the three of us. But we all got together and watched it. And I just think this is, you know, again, as we alluded to, there is the history around it. There is the fact that this is made by an entirely either blacklisted creatives, like the screenwriter, like the director, you know, the screenwriter who gets credit at the top of the film. I don't know, you know, it struck me, Michael Wilson's Salt of the Earth. So nothing more, you know, screenwriter than that, right? That I should be on the film.
Well, for better or worse, it is more of the screenwriter's movie than the director's movie.
And do you know, by the way, Tom, you're familiar with Michael Wilson?
No.
You are, though, because he wrote
sure are.
not only the movie that I love, Friendly Persuasion, which I submitted to the Register recently. He's also the writer of one of the writers anyway, on The Bridge on the River Kwai, Lawrence of Arabia,
right. That's right. Yeah.
Planet of the Apes.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That name did ring a bell, but also because that's one of the Bond producers, writers' names.
Yeah.
Michael
I mean,
G. Wilson.
obviously, you know, they did eventually cut the scene in Planet of the Apes where Dr. Zaius does a 15-minute monologue on the merits of socialism, but it was there. I'm sure it was there.
Well, it's just as misogynistic. So.
What a picture. No. So. In any event, I think one thing that's interesting, and I'm going to ask Kyle you to speak to this, which is the first time we watched this, we watched it as part of like a triple feature we were doing. You had no context for it. We were not like beforehand discussing the movie. And I think before you went into this rewatch, you obviously read up on its history and its making. So I guess I want you to speak a bit to what your experience was watching this. Having, you know, again, you went into it the first time just not knowing anything about it other than it's on the registry, and then going into it having read up on it. You know, what was that like, and what was kind of your takeaway from this experience?
I'm not gonna lie and tell you that the first time was enjoyable. I don't think I had particularly a lot of the context, so I think just in terms of the context of the film, it was very difficult for me. Once I knew it was going to be on the docket for season 4 and did a little bit more of the research, I got a little bit more interested. I've always been familiar with the Red Scare, but I haven't really done the full research that I needed to. My understanding is very similar to what we talked about at the beginning of this episode, which is a very black and white understanding. So I knew immediately when I was doing my research that it became very apparent that this film, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, probably the only one in which everybody that is associated with this film was blacklisted in some way. It's one thing to have a career and be blacklisted, but to have all of those creative hands being a part of that, I think is very rare, especially on a or a film that is centered around labor movement and specifically women's contribution to labor movement. The thing that I think I was most interested in, I was wondering if maybe you have more insight though, is obviously because it was blacklisted, doesn't necessarily get a lot of the recognition or love, both I guess after its release in addition to its actual release, or at least domestically. It does find some success internationally in, I believe, East and Western Europe, if I'm correct.
Yeah. And it was, I mean, it was eventually allowed to be screened, especially I think in maybe I'm getting this date wrong, but 1976, maybe 67, but I think 76. I don't have that jotted down, but there reached a point where we all kind of unanimously agreed the Hollywood Blacklist was stupid as a nation.
Yeah.
I mentioned like Dalton Trumbo gets all the attention, gets a Bryan Cranston movie about him and everything, but like, Ring Lardner writes MASH under his own name. The new Hollywood crowd is perfectly fine working with blacklisted talent. The Hollywood Blacklist sort of goes the way of the production code, right? Where after a certain point, the reason the production code stopped having power was enough people just went, who gives a shit? Outside of film, the comics code is much the same way. The comics code came along, and like as a comic book publisher, you were terrified to not have that seal of approval on your book until the day came that publishers just went, who gives a shit? Like, we're just not going to have the seal. Who cares? People will still buy the book. It didn't help the careers of most of the people involved.
Yeah.
Like obviously, like Wilson writes his scripts, and William Greer, the actor who plays the sheriff, who was blacklisted as a socialist at the time, goes on to play Grandpa Walton on the Waltons. But I think, what you have here with this is a movie that, by the time people discover it, is more of an interesting curio, and I think an interesting curio in more than just being a blacklisted film. You also have to consider by the time this film is being seen, this preceded the Chicano rights movement. This preceded Cesar Chavez, right? So this is offering insight into a side of America that is now in the spotlight. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but I'm sure Tom will be able to at some point, maybe quicker than me, but like, there are certain movies where they weren't acknowledged as much in their day. They weren't really, maybe they were seen as flops, or they just weren't seen at all, that showed a side of America that wasn't in the spotlight. And once it was in the spotlight, the film suddenly got more attention, felt more prescient. I mean, like, this is not perfect, but like The Boys in the Band is to one degree or another an example of that. Right? Yeah. I think there are a lot of older films that from 20, 30 years ago that tried to, as sensitively as they could, tackle trans issues that now get kind of reclaimed in a different way. I was like, Boys Don't Cry won an Oscar, so I'm not going to say it wasn't seen, right? But it gets viewed in a different lens. And I think that Salt of the Earth, beyond just being blacklisted, when you consider that it is showing, this is not a whitewashed story. In fact, so much so, I didn't know this until I was reading up on it today. So Herbert J. Biberman, the director of this film, who I was saying to you guys off mic, I've gained a lot of respect for and research for this. He was married to Oscar-winning actress Gail Sundergaard. And Gail Sundergaard, who was a white actress, was supposed to play the lead in this movie. And a lot of the people working on it were very much like, well, we're going to make an independent film with Gail Sundergaard. Like, that's going to make money. People will show up to see that. And when he was talking to the town and talking to the miners, Biberman was the one who made the decision to essentially fire his own wife off the movie.
Wow.
Because he felt it didn't feel right to have a Latina role played by a white woman. And that's why they wind up getting Rosario Revueltas, who herself, while not a blacklisted communist, was herself blacklisted in her home country. The woman you see in the lead in this film, she was a Mexican actress who had gotten in trouble in Mexico with the Catholic Church because she had made a film called Girls in Uniform, which is one of the earliest films to explore lesbianism in like explicit detail. Oh, wow. And that got her in trouble with the Catholic Church in Mexico. And so she fled to the U.S. and got this role. Which I just thought was super interesting, but speaks to, in a way, not just how forward-thinking this movie is. For all the qualms that one can have with the structure of it, or the pacing, or
the look of it, or the acting, or the writing.
The entertainment value, the qualms that one could have, like, it's remarkably forward-thinking, and I do have to say, like, Biberman in particular you come away with a sense of the extraordinary integrity he had as an artist. No one's going to say that he was a phenomenal director. In fact, I was watching a film, a biopic made about Biberman, starring Jeff Goldblum as Herbert J. Biberman, where even in the film, the other characters are acknowledging, like, he's not a great director. He's no John Ford. Can we get anybody else to direct this? But he was a man of integrity, undeniably. And it can't be said that this film isn't sincere in what it's doing. I think that sincerity is very clear as you watch it. Maybe a little too sincere, perhaps a little too much.
Maybe a little too sure of its messaging to overcome any shortcomings of filmmaking style and entertainment, and just said, well, we're right, so people are going to enjoy this, yeah? And it's like, sure, maybe.
It is,
I don't know.
It is a
It's
little...
it's like if you've ever worked like at a supermarket or a retail store, and you're going through the motions of getting hired, and like your first day on the job, they show you a video that's like, hi, welcome to Target. We are a family. Have you ever heard of unions? Well, in a family, you don't need a union. And it's like, oh, this is just the opposite of that. It's like, hey, unions are good, right?
Well, it you know what it feels like in some ways, and I don't mean this to be negative, but like energy-wise, it feels like watching an Ed Wood movie. Like it feels like everybody believes in what they're doing and they're putting on a show, and especially like a Glenn or Glenda Ed Wood movie, right? Where it's just like it's sincere in what it's saying. But the problem, the problem you run into is it's also the fact that it's like this is a movie that like you get about halfway through. You know, Tom, I talked to you a lot about the fact that like one of the things that I find frustrating whenever I talk to somebody, you know, we're New Yorkers, we spend time in Brooklyn. When you talk to somebody who's like a newly discovered socialist, right? You know, somebody who discovered a bunch of podcasts and YouTube videos in 2016, and all they want to do is talk to you about how they've read theory, right? And it's like when you're talking to them, there's a party that wants to go like, they'll be telling you something and acting like they're telling you some new information. Like, I've read Kropotkin, dude. Like, I've read The Conquest of Bread. You're not saying something that I don't know. I've read this, I've processed it, and I've also moved on from it. Like, I've developed my own thoughts. This is very much like I was watching it and I was trying to remember like what this is. And this is essentially like this is Engels. Friedrich Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, which is one of his like I'm laying out the role of women in society and all of that. And it just feels like somebody read that 15 times and was like, well, if we just make a movie that shows that, it'll convince people. Now, obviously, I want to be clear, it doesn't cover all of Engels because it leaves out the part where Engels says that capitalism made the Greeks have sex with young men. That part's not in there.
Well, then that's a negative towards the movie, because how do you get rid of the only true statement in the entire thing? I'm
gonna get some comment yelling at me for like, well, no, but if you translate Engels as German, he's not actually saying. Shut up. Shut up.
Listen, I don't care.
Move on.
This movie is like what it's just like what I said. I mentioned before. It's just communists are fucking exhausting, bro. Like, your message is not enough. Like, I'm sorry. Like, sometimes the form has to be important to the story you're telling. Functionality isn't everything. And sometimes your form is so bad, your functionality fails. Because this movie just feels... It's very sincere, but it's so sincere in a way that it feels phony. You just never really get a sense of like... And like, oh, it's based on this real strike and blah, blah, blah. And like, none of the stuff that's happening in it, I don't think happened in strikes back then, other strikes, whatever. We saw Harlan County. Hell, if anything, this movie could have went a little fucking harder because we saw in Harlan County, oh yeah, back then we know they would fucking shoot people. And hell, not to come, like, don't take this out of context, but like back then, they wouldn't have thought twice about shooting Mexicans. Like, I'm sorry, like it just feels a little too naive, and it's like, and it's good intentions, and it just makes you go, fuck, it's not even like entertaining. It's not even like a Corman movie. Give me a Corman movie.
I hear what you're saying, but I do think part of the problem that I identified on this viewing is not just like, oh, it's trying to be, communist messaging. I think it's the fact, like, one of the things you clock into with this is it's very consciously trying to be, because it doesn't look like or feel like at times Hollywood movies, right? It's an independent. It's trying very hard to be a Soviet realist film. Like, if you've ever watched any of those Kino Pravda films by Ziga Vertov, right? I'm not talking Eisenstein, because Eisenstein was a real stylist, but those Ziga Vertov films, things like that. The way that it does the close-ups on like the cups and the suffering, or the suffering face, a cup passing between hands, or like suffering faces, and the little kind of monologues that they had them do of like, when I was a child, it was called San Marcos. The owners changed it to Zinktown, but the flowers are ours. That kind of thing. The land the mine was on began with my husband's grandfather. Now it belongs to the company. That all feels like Kino Pravda, right? And I'll say this. I think the movie works if they are capable, and I don't mean this to be a criticism, but like, if it was a movie that was like, we're going to make a Soviet realist film in the U.S., similar to, we talked about earlier this season, Bonnie and Clyde, and how Bonnie and Clyde, at its very core, is a bunch of very gifted artists going like, we're going to make a French New Wave film in America. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that strikes me with this film is these are all ex-Hollywood guys who all know how to make Hollywood movies. And so like things like the score feels incongruous to what I'm seeing on screen. Whereas if the movie doesn't have a score, like those Ziga Vertov films, I wonder if it has a different impact. Because there's that very triumphant score when the people are picketing, right? But then the visual is just a bunch of guys walking in a small circle in the middle of nowhere with picket signs. And the score, I think, diminishes that image. Similarly, though, I think if the movie was entirely dry realism, but there's the scene where like the two guys are beating up the husband in the back of the car, that has some juice to it. And it's like, for some reason, having that scene where the guys are beating up the husband, or when the woman's like having the baby, where there is a bit of energy to it, then kind of makes the scenes like the union meetings that feel like the Phantom Menace Senate meetings all the more brutal. I think it's like these guys can't resist being a little bit Hollywood, and that ends up undoing what they're trying to do.
You bringing up them beating up the husband in the back seat, I found no juice in that. My mind just went to the scene in Blazing Saddles when they're punching the old lady. Oh, have you ever seen such cruelty? Oh, it's like, oh, that's right. This guy's not an actor.
Yeah, I mean,
they didn't really do much to mitigate the fact.
I don't think there's something wrong with not using.
No, there's nothing wrong. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Like we were talking before, how many fucking movies did I pick this year that are David Gordon movies?
Or like,
I don't have a problem with that.
Robert Bresson, right? Like, Hazard Balthazar, and of course, it's just
Sean Baker does it.
Yeah, we're not trying to, and I'm not. I don't. This is not like a bashing session or anything like that. Like it has to be taken in the context of what it is. But it is a fascinating object. One thing it's interesting that I did want to note in a way, I've brought up obviously Navasky's naming names enough times, but Biberman and particularly Salt of the Earth only comes up in here once. And all it says, it's one of the concluding chapters called Victims, and all it says is, perhaps in the absence of the blacklist, the political culture of the 1930s and 40s would have given birth to a newly experimental cinema in the 1950s. Perhaps Salt of the Earth, 1954, product of the Blacklist underground, which, whatever its limitations, anticipated both the feminist and independent film producing movements by more than a decade, not to mention its premature concern for the Chicano, is but a crude specimen of what might have been. Or perhaps not. The point is that we will never know. We will also never know how many of the taboos that have beset commercial television in the United States since the 1940s, when its habits, values, assumptions, and basic perspectives of the world were being shaped, were determined by the blacklist atmosphere. And I bring that up because that's another interesting angle to look at this from. Not just the fact that it's an independent film from a time people were not doing independent films. Tom, you mentioned Corman, right?
Yeah.
There is no Corman at this time. There is no Cassavetes at this time. Like, this is...
Yeah.
Independent film doesn't exist.
It's not a thing. And I kind of started off the episode saying that this is a movie, I think, more than any movie we've covered so far, where its importance is more about the outside stuff than the actual content within. We may agree with the sentiments found within the movie, but it really is the stuff about the blacklist and hiring all those people, and its thematic work and its forward-thinking ideas about women in the workplace and the Chicano rights and all of that stuff. And the independent movie aspect of it. Like this really is, this is a few years before Cassavetes starts roaming the streets of New York City shooting. Faces is the first one.
Isn't it Shadows?
Shadows is Shadows. Yeah, Shadows. Faces is with Jenna Rollins. That's the second one.
Teaser for season 5.
Yeah.
Shadows
so he's a few years before he's roaming the streets of New York shooting Shadows. 17 years before Night of the Living Dead.
Mm-hmm.
This is 10 years before Carnival of Souls. This is really a big first step in the idea that American movies can be made outside of the system. We already knew that at this point we already knew, even if it wasn't as widely available back then, there was a world cinema. So there were ways to get something other than American content. But the idea that Americans can make something outside of the system with their own money, with their own know-how, and with their own gumption was, and still is, an important thing, because now more than ever, we're at a place technologically where anybody can do that. And honestly, let's get more of it,
Well,
whatever.
and I mean,
But
about, I think he makes a great point about, Salt of the Earth represents, in a way, there's so many things in history where we ask, what if, right? What if this? What would it have looked like if this had happened? Salt of the Earth exists as this strange window into, we do actually have an example of what if Hollywood had been allowed to evolve naturally without the imposition of the blacklist. Yeah. And I am not Navasky calls it a crude, technically limited thing, but there is a question of, if there had been more after Salt of the Earth, right? If rather than being blacklisted, this film had found an audience, and there had been this attempt to can we do our version of Soviet realism? The question that it comes down to is, does New Hollywood happen as late as it does? If Salt of the Earth is out there innovating, right? And it is, for all its qualms, it's trying to innovate. We can argue about its success.
Yeah.
But God bless, it's trying to innovate. Are we chasing the French and the Italians in the 60s? Or have we led the way? I think that's an interesting element to this as well, because for all for all of its stiffness at points, this is a movie that is centering a female lead, right? This is a movie that is trying to do something different and trying to do it outside the system. And I also have to give it some props for the fact that, we keep saying it's communist messaging. The one thing I have to give it props for is it is as much, if not more, an examination of the role of women within a socialist organization than it is just about a socialist victory over the boss, right? And a worker's victory. Because the crux of this film's plot is about that conflict that you see pop up in a lot of leftist movements, right? I mean, go to the American 60s, right? Go to, when Timothy Leary was hiding out in Algeria, and he was staying with one of the high-ranking Black Panthers. Leary's wife was deeply off-put about the fact that like this was supposed to be the free love, left progressive, leftist Marxist group, and all the women were being told to do kitchen chores. And there's that point in the film where like the women are talking about like the children took the bedroom as usual and the men took the parlor as usual, right? You do have to give the movie props to the fact that it is not just like, oh, the bosses are bad, but it is also taking a lot of, I would argue, a lot of the leftists that guys like Biberman and Wilson probably saw in Hollywood and taking them to task too of like, I mean, it's similar to even today, right? I'm not trying to pull it too much into that, but like we all knew guys who were real leftists in 2016 who actively despised Hillary Clinton. And we were able to kind of, you told yourself, like, they'd be like, no, it's her policies. And then in 2020, they also actively despised Elizabeth Warren. And then they started to actively despise AOC. And now they actively despise Kamala Harris. And you're like, buddy, I at some point, you have to see a trend, Like, I don't know, man. Like, I don't hang with you anymore after I saw you screaming at that woman outside that bar in Williamsburg. And now I see your posts on Twitter, and it's like, there's a connection here between all of these things, man. Maybe you need to think about that a minute. Maybe just because you've read enough Marx does not mean you are the most enlightened soul. And you have to give this movie props for calling that out,
No, it's really literally the case. Like I said before, quite the opposite of Birth of a Nation, which we recorded a few days ago. You can this time we have absolutely no qualms thematically and morally with the movie at hand that we're watching. Technical issues might be quite different on opposite sides of the spectrum here, but at least this time I am not morally upset about the thing I'm watching. I'm just cinematically exhausted.
I mean, the one thing I did find too with it, and Kyle, I want to make sure you can get some more in before I hope we're not just talking over you. Remember, I feel like every once in a while you forget that you're so used to being sitting here not being able to talk while you produce the show. But one thing I did want to just note with all of that is that for as much as we could talk about this film being dated or whatever, can we all agree there is a moment when they're talking about the radio and the husband goes, "This installment plan, it is the curse of the working man." How many of us thought of this many subscriptions we're on for software and shit? Am I wrong?
Oh, bro, I'm still paying off my TV.
Yeah. It's the well, I was just thinking about like the fact that like I don't know. This is
what are credit cards if not just a payment plan? Hey, spend this money now and pay it off when you can.
Yep.
With an extra fee. Wink, wink. Must twirl.
Or just the fact that, not to be all back in my day about it, but back in my day, you paid a flat fee and you owned editing software. And now, for me to edit this show, I have to pay a monthly fee for the privilege.
Dude, I saw the tweet before and I put it on my Instagram story, but maybe my most boomer complaint is that I wish everything didn't need an account.
Mm-hmm.
Why do I have to sign up for a light bulb that switches colors? Why do I need to sign up for my TV speakers? Why do I need to sign up for an account for the camera that we install to watch the dog when we're not at home? It feels like, hey, connect to the camera. Great. Do you want more news and notifications about this product? No, I just want to look at my dog. It's all dumb. I hate everything. I hate modern life. That's the thing. It almost feels like this is one of those movies that is kind of ripe for a remake, where the best remakes, for the most part, are things that were they had good ideas, but the execution didn't come through. This is that, and this is not an issue that has gone away. the misogyny part, obviously Mike was talking about that. We kind of still pretty much don't like women. We've been seeing a whole transvestigation thing about a woman who is just a woman, but she punched an Italian in the hard to nose, and now they're just like, oh, well, that's obviously a man.
Tom, I want to give you a chance to correct you. Punched a
I heard
woman
it
in the hard to nose.
Punched a woman too hard in the nose.
Yes,
Yeah.
but you said they punched a woman in the hard
to nose.
Whatever. I'm tired. We're seeing all of that, but obviously the workers stuff is becoming an even bigger problem every day in a way that I don't think people really truly understand. They want to bitch and moan about inflation and that salaries or what have you aren't rising. Guys, that's a union. That's a thing that unions could help you out with. If we didn't let that fuck Reagan destroy the even not even just unions in the 80s, but just the concept of unions. So even if a unions existed past them, the only unions that fucking people these days respect are police unions for some fucking reason. We don't have workers' rights. It's just like a whole fucking mess of like none of this stuff is out of date. So you could take it and you can either make it a period piece, or you could kind of just translate the story to now. Hell, do what Rod Serling did. Make it a fucking sci-fi story and just be like,
to be clear, it's public domain, so you literally can. There's no cover. Do it. Somebody watching this, go do it. You can't be stopped.
I will say there are two adaptations, because even though this has been blacklisted and whatnot, I did notice as I was doing research that there were two different adaptations of this film that I wanted to highlight. One was in 2000 that was made into a 2-act opera from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which I think is the absolute coolest thing. An opera professor commissioned it. It had killer reviews. I cannot find any video of this online, nor does the source cited in the article exist anymore because it's a 404 page, but I do want to try to hunt that down. Most recently, and a little bit easier to find, there was apparently a 2022 Audible podcast series about the movie's production. It's a fictionalized account.
Wow. I didn't know that. But it's got a
shit ton of names in it. John Hamm is in it. Kate Mara. Giancarlo Esposito lends his voice. Yeah, I am just hearing about this, but it's definitely worth getting an Audible subscription for to check out.
I don't think they're a sponsor anymore. Is that you don't need
to
plug them.
They are whenever. They don't get rid of sponsors. Once you are one, you're a sponsor for life. So yeah.
Well, cool. Then use our offer code that we don't know what it is. Anyway.
YMO pod, I think.
Yeah. So with all that in mind, winding down as we always do. This is a dumb one, but Tom, how do you think?
Zero.
I'm not allowed to participate in this.
Tom, Kyle, how do either of you think the blacklisted film Salt of the Earth fared at the Academy Awards that year?
It swept the fuckers.
Oh, gee. Let's 0.
So here's what I'm going to say. That's true. However, you might be shocked to discover one of the Hollywood 10 was actually semi-recognized this year. So one of the Hollywood 10 was Edward Dmytryk. Now, Edward Dmytryk would go on to name names, but he was initially part of the Hollywood 10. And that's important because while Salt of the Earth didn't get any nominations, the Best Picture nominees that year were The Caine Mutiny, which Edward Dmytryk directed. So one of the Hollywood 10 had a Best Picture nominee the same year as Salt of the Earth, in case you want that contrast. And do with that contrast what you will. The other nominees were The Country Girl, 7 Brides for 7 Brothers, 3 Coins in the Fountain, and are you ready for the topper? The winner, the year Salt of the Earth came out, On the Waterfront. So how's that for a slice of cosmic irony? Well, Kyle, thank you so much for coming on as a guest. I know this is, again, typically the rule is you're on the very last episode, but we're moving some things around, so I hope you don't mind that this is coming a little earlier in the release schedule.
Not at all. No, I'm happy to learn a little bit more about the Hollywood Blacklist, which is a little blind spot in my own film history knowledge. So thank you.
Well, we'll do this again next season with you. Obviously, you're here all the time, so no reason to throw any.
Keep me locked in the basement.
Yeah,
Help.
we got no control. Yeah, but this time you're on camera, so we can't tell if you just walk away at random points. We can tell now.
This is true. We can.
But everybody else, stick around. We'll be right back with all of our picks for the National Film Registry.
The National Film Registry isn't some fixed object, frozen in time. It's always growing, adding new titles every year. These annual selections are made by the National Film Preservation Board, with members like Martin Scorsese, Alfre Woodard, and Leonard Maltin, and representatives from organizations like the Academy, the DGA, and the AFI coming together to debate and decide. But they don't just pull titles out of thin air. They pull from the public, people like you and us, who can submit their nominations for the registry in a form on the Library of Congress's website. What we do, at the end of each episode, is have Mike and Tom pick films not yet in the registry that they feel should be, inspired by that day's topic. At the end of each season, those films will be formally submitted to the National Film Registry for consideration, on behalf of You're Missing Out. Here are today's picks.
All right, so we're at the part of the episode where we pick some movies that we choose to go with the movie of choice that we're going to put up for registry induction. Kyle's getting one because he's part of the team, and, well, something different to do, so whatever. Kyle, tell us what you want to pick. It's got to be at least 10 years old, and, well, based on what I'm going to pick, doesn't necessarily have to be good, so...
I am picking a short documentary film from 1950. It's called The Hollywood 10. It is a 15-minute documentary directed by John Barry, who was also part of the Hollywood Blacklist, and is basically a giant fuck it. It is the Hollywood 10 more or less explaining why they are put in this position, why they are unable to testify, and what that would mean for politics and for the American people going forward. And if you have never heard of the Hollywood 10, if you are not familiar with the Red Scare or the Hollywood Blacklist, this 15-minute documentary from 1950 is really good. It's really good and really gives you insight into at least somebody that I imagine that you would be interested in trying to learn more about how they came to be on this list. So my pick from 1950 is The Hollywood 10.
So for me, and it's as we talked about at the beginning, the scope and history of communism in America is extraordinarily complicated and extraordinarily nuanced. And I think that the conversation around communism and Soviet American relations and the American Communist Party is something that gets brought up just to score a point when talking about the Red Scare, or it gets swept under the rug entirely. And obviously, today we were talking about Salt of the Earth, which is a movie by a group of blacklisted artists that never got seen. The person who ultimately told the story of the American Communist Party is very much the opposite of that. Rather than being blacklisted, it was the man who had the most creative cachet, the most blank check a Hollywood director, producer, star could possibly get. A man on top of the world making a passion project, not just about the American Communist Party, but specifically about John Reed, the author of 10 Days That Shook the World, the most famous American communist. It is the epic Warren Beatty film Reds. Now, Reds is a movie that I think is for people of a certain age more talked about than seen. It's the same year as Raiders of the Lost Ark, and one's a real fun adventure film, and the other is a 3-hour plus romantic drama about the rise and fall of American communism. I remember when I went to watch Reds for the first time, I was anticipating a chore, and I was blown away because you really feel the sincerity from Beatty on it, that it is about that feeling that I kind of talked about up top, this idea of this sense of betrayal. of going into something feeling like, well, all of these people have the same politics I do. I can trust them, all that, because the story that Beatty tells is not just about John Reed in Russia or John Reed founding the party, but ultimately working with the Soviet Union and their Communist Party, and going to Soviet Union, discovering this is not what we thought it would be. It is about sort of idealism dying. It is a tragic epic that paints a portrait of a beautiful failed movement. And I think the more we get away from that in history, not just understanding what happened in the horrors of the Soviet Union and understanding the horrors of America's Red Scare and understanding all of that, do we reduce it to black and white? But I just think it is important to understand the messy parts of American history. And that is something that Beatty brilliantly captured in Reds. It won a bunch of awards in its day and then doesn't get talked about much now, but I think it should. I think it's a Hollywood icon working at the height of his power to make something that nobody else could have gotten made. It is one of the most blank check movies of all time, and I think it's a remarkable work. So I am submitting Reds to the National Film Registry.
That's all well and good, folks. I'm here to ruin the party. I wanted something that would revive me from the coma that this movie put me into. Something that was pro-union, pro-labor, pro-worker, anti-capitalist, all of that, but with an actual heartbeat. And not just a heartbeat, but a roaring engine that'll keep you going hours after the movie ends, where you go, wow, that movie was so fucking stupid, but goddamn was it fun. I mentioned Roger Corman before, and this is directed by a Roger Corman boy. I'm talking about White Line Fever, Jan Michael Vincent, directed by Jonathan Kaplan. It's a dumbass fucking guy driving his truck movie, but the man doesn't want him to unionize, so they keep trying to get him, and he fights back, man. Pro-union, pro-labor, fuck the man. Let's go. Jan Michael Vincent is my pick. White Line Fever for the National Film Registry. Let's fucking go, baby. Dumb as shit. I promised you. I told you. White Line Fever.
Next week,
Amanda Rush is here to talk about Carmen Jones.
The first time I'm watching it, right in that first song, she talks about, if you play hard to get, I might like you. And really, in that opening scene, Joe is the only one not giving her his full, unadulterated attention. And do I think that is maybe part of what makes her chase after him so hard? 100%.
You're Missing Out is a production of Neon Night Media. It's hosted by Mike Natale and Tom Lorenzo. The show is produced by Kyle Lampar and edited by Mike Natale and Kyle Lampar. More information about our hosts and guests are in the show notes. Thank you to Amanda Rush for our social media, and all of you for checking us out.
If you're listening right now or want to take the show on the go, every episode is available as an audio podcast. Follow You're Missing Out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, please leave a review and a rating. It helps folks find the show.
Want to watch the show or watch some of the films along with us? Great, that's why we're doing this. Don't leave us alone out here. Check out our YouTube channel. We've got video versions of every episode, uploads of some of the National Film Registry titles we're discussing, commentary tracks, and live streams. And once a month, I'll be uploading some content that's exclusive to the YouTube channel. So be sure to click subscribe and hit that little bell to be notified as soon as new stuff goes up. Because, let's be fucking real, I ain't sticking to a goddamn schedule.
So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
And we'll see you next time.
And you'll see us next time. Because we don't watch you, you're watching us.